Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going to dive into one of the more interesting characters in American history, George Armstrong Custer. It's definitely on my bucket list to get out to Montana to visit the battlefield of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or as the battle, as it's known to the Native American side, the Battle of the Greasy Grass. We're going to get there. I'm hoping sometime in 2023 I can make that happen. So we can tell more of that story, because it's a fascinating story. Both sides of that story are quite fascinating. But today we're going to dive into Biographics, and we're going to see what Simon has to say about this really fascinating figure of George Armstrong Custer, who is a fellow Northeast Ohioan. I've actually been to his birthplace, a little place called New Rumley, Ohio. It's about an hour away from me, south of me. So let's dive into this one.
In 1876, the United States was gearing up to celebrate the 100th anniversary of its founding. The country needed to celebrate. An economic depression had gripped the nation for the last 3 years. There was controversy and scandal surrounding the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, and hanging over everyone were the unhealed scars of the recently concluded Civil War.
I love that they start with that, because that's often lost in telling the story of Little Bighorn, which is at the end of June 1876, is the context of that story. The context is there had been the Panic of 1873 up until the 1930s, where we had what we know today as the Great Depression. The aftermath of that was known as the Great Depression. So it was a devastating time. A lot of people lost their jobs. Very, very difficult circumstances. Like he said, this is right on the heels of the American Civil War. We're right at the end. It's an election year, and we're going to have that horrible, very controversial election of 1876 between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. But at this point, it's Grant. Grant's at the end of his second term. He's lost most of the ability to really have any great impact on what's going on. Most of the country has turned against continued Reconstruction, which by this point is just basically military occupation in the South. So everybody's kind of ready to be done with all that, and they've kind of moved on. They're starting to move on from the Civil War. The focus is on the West and completing Manifest Destiny. You've had the Transcontinental Railroad, and you have this situation with this last great war against the Native Americans. But I think we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, because we got to tell the whole story of Custer first.
Then, from the west, word came of a military disaster. In faraway Montana Territory, in a place called the Little Bighorn, over 250 troopers of the Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment had been killed in a fight with hostile Indians. Most shocking of all, though, was the fact that the regiment's famed commander, Colonel George Armstrong Custer, was among the dead. At the time, Custer was one of the most famous men in America. He'd been a Northern hero during the Civil War, famous for his dramatic cavalry charges and responsible for some of the Union's biggest victories.
And there was some talk, I don't know how serious it was, I don't know how credible it is, some talk of him having political ambition, maybe even the presidency at some point. He definitely had just ridiculous amounts of ambition. He's still only in his mid-30s at this point. Remember, he graduated from West Point right at the time the Civil War started, so he was a super young guy.
After the war, he became the country's most famous Indian fighter, due just as much to his own propensity for self-promotion as for his military skill. He'd also been involved in a number of scandals that would have destroyed his military career had he been anybody else. But he always managed to find a way out, a remarkable streak of good fortune that contemporaries know as Custer's luck. Now that luck had run out, but it seemed in death, Custer was even more famous than he was alive. The dramatic last stand made by him and his cavalrymen was almost immediately compared to the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, with Custer taking on the role of the Spartan King Leonidas. For decades, Custer was held up as an American martyr to the winning of the West.
Now, a lot of that, though, is because of Custer's wife, Libby, his widow. She did a remarkable job of kind of doing her best to show him in a positive light to the country. She made it her mission, much like Eliza Hamilton did with her husband, Alexander Hamilton, in the aftermath of his scandal and his death in a duel and all those things. She spends the rest of her life kind of building his image. Libby Custer does the exact same thing. But there's really no comparison between Thermopylae and what happened with Custer. Number one, Thermopylae was 300 Spartans standing, and it wasn't just 300 Spartans. There were thousands of other troops along with them, standing against an invasion of their homeland. The opposite's happening here. These are Custer's troops attacking a Native American village, and it's not a situation where they're making a stand while they just slaughter, tens of thousands of the enemy. I mean, they're kind of running, and it's kind of a rolling retreat that's happening until they eventually get wiped out.
A hero without peer. A more recent analysis has been more critical, however, not only of his active participation in the shameful actions taken by the American government against the Indian tribes of the Great Plains, but also for his reckless, impulsive decisions, many of which got people killed.
Yep, absolutely. Audie goes to West
George
Point.
Armstrong Custer was born on December the 5th, 1839, in New Rumley, Ohio, a tiny and remote farming community located 100 miles south of the city of Cleveland.
So, yeah, if you go there today, they actually have a whole site of his birthplace. I don't think, unless something has changed since I was there last, there's no buildings there, but the foundations of the place where he was born are still there.
The Custers were a large, hard-working family with a lot of love to go around. George, nicknamed Audie because he kept mispronouncing his middle name when he was a toddler, was an outgoing boy who liked to read and was a decent student compared to his peers. At the age of 16, he graduated from primary school and briefly became a school teacher until he achieved what he had declared to be his life's ambition, an appointment to the United States Military Academy.
Yeah, a lot of people think that Custer was from Michigan because he kind of identified with Michigan, not only because he led Michigan troops in the Civil War, but then afterwards he marries a woman from Michigan, and I think she was from Michigan, and he had lived there a little while. I think he lived there with his sister for a while, but he grew up in Ohio, and he spent the majority of his pre-war life in Ohio. The school he taught at, I think, was in Hopedale, which is actually the town over from where my great-grandmother was born. He definitely was an Ohioan.
West Point, New York, the training ground for the nation's army officers. Cadet Custer's record at West Point from 1857 to 1861 is legendary for all the wrong reasons. One of the most popular students in his class, it seemed wherever there was a mischief going on, Custer could be found right in the middle of it. He enjoyed pushing boundaries and testing the limits of authority. He was always in trouble for something, racking up 726 demerits during his first 4 years at the academy, one of the worst disciplinary records in the history of the school.
And that's why he ends up finishing at the bottom of his class. It's not because he wasn't smart. It's not because he wasn't capable of being a good soldier. He just couldn't stay out of trouble. And so those demerits knocked him down.
Academically, he was a firm believer in the philosophy, C's get degrees. He'd do the bare minimum to pass the classes, never studying if he could avoid it. He'd prefer to do things that interested him instead. Sometimes these interests got him into trouble too. He was treated for gonorrhea in his junior year, probably contracted from a New York prostitute. With all these shenanigans during his time at West Point, it seems a near miracle that he managed to graduate at all, but he did. Dead last. Under normal circumstances, this would not have boded well for his future prospects in the army, and it is likely nobody would have ever heard of George Armstrong Custer.
Great point. And so what they do is in 1861, because of, you're going from a peacetime army of, 10, 20,000 to a 2 million man army by the end of the American Civil War. And so there's a desperate, and half of your trained officers are going to fight for the South on the other side. So you basically have half the officers of a 20,000 man army to lead a 2 million man army. And so you desperately need officers. And so what they do is they take the junior class at West Point and they graduate them a year early. They have a class of May 1861 and a class of June 1861. And so Custer gets rapidly thrown out into the field and he gets a staff position in the Army of the Potomac.
But these were not normal circumstances. When Custer graduated in June 1861, the Civil War was already 2 months old and the Union Army needed all the qualified officers it could get. Custer was spat out by the Academy almost directly onto the battlefield. Less than a month after graduating, Custer was on hand to witness the Union disaster at the First Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war, and a stinging defeat for the North. Custer would next see action in March 1862, now a cavalry officer in the newly reorganized Army of the Potomac under the command of Major General George McClellan. McClellan's Peninsula campaign that spring failed due to his own timidity and the emergence of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to leadership of the rebel Army of Northern Virginia, but Custer fought well, catching the attention of McClellan, who promoted him to aide-de-camp. When McClellan was fired by President Abraham Lincoln that November, Custer found himself out of a job for a few months. His next assignment was as aide to General Alfred Pleasonton, the commander of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps. At the end of June 1863, Pleasonton received permission to remove so-called political generals, politicians playing at war who weren't actually good at it, with professionals willing to risk their lives leading their units. One of the officers...
So this is a really important time. In the summer of 1863, we start to see, because like I said earlier, there's such a desperate need for officers that a lot of men got really high-ranking positions because of their political connections or their political positions. So you have people like Congressman Dan Sickles, who ends up being a general, and you have a lot of people who are in Congress or are senators or in local government, or people who are wealthy and are able to help raise a large number of troops, either through their finances or through their political connections. And so they're kind of starting to deal with some of that. You know, a great example is out west, Thorne and Grant's side for years had been General John McClernand, and he was just a nightmare. And finally, Grant was able to get rid of him during the Vicksburg campaign.
As he believed fit that bill was Captain Custer. Only 2 years after graduating from the Academy at the tender age of 23, Custer was promoted to Brigadier General, a truly meteoric rise for a man that his troops would call the Boy General.
Yeah, I mean, and this happened other times. He was hardly the youngest general on either side. I think the youngest Union general was Galusha Pennypacker, who I think was 20. So Custer's a little bit older than that. But this is a pretty remarkable thing, to have people who are already in positions of that authority removed, and then you take a guy who's a captain and promote him all the way to brigadier general. But it's not unheard of, and it makes sense given how well he was known to the general staff because he had been on staff. So they knew what he was capable of. They knew, and this, I think, speaks to his intelligence, because he was obviously trusted enough to be bumped up that high. That they saw something in him, and they had probably experienced his knowledge of things over the past several months.
Custer was given command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, known as the Wolverines. The first assignment was crucial. Robert E. Lee's army had invaded the northern states, marching through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, hoping to trap the Union Army and destroy it. The Army of the Potomac, now commanded by George Meade, followed, making sure that they stayed between Lee and the federal capital, Washington, D.C. The two armies would crash into each other on the 1st of July, 1863, at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. On the morning of July the 3rd, 1863, General Custer's brigade was posted 3 miles east of the Union infantry lines. They had seen sporadic fighting over the last 2 days as the infantry slugged away at each other in the bloodiest battle of the entire war.
So so we've talked a lot about Gettysburg, and obviously we know cavalry's right at the center of the beginning of Gettysburg, with General John Buford's division being the first Union troops to fight on the battlefield. But after that, Buford and the other cavalry are kind of sent to their traditional positions on the battlefield when there's a pitched battle happening, and that's to cover the flanks, to protect supplies, those kinds of things. And at this point, July 1st, Jeb Stuart is kind of AWOL with his entire cavalry division. Nobody knows where he is for sure. He's out there somewhere, and he shows up on July 2nd, and so Lee immediately has a plan for him, which is to go around and, at the time that Pickett's charge is happening, threaten the rear of the Union, which is not just about, it wasn't simply a matter of, oh, go hit them from the rear as we hit them from the front. This is much more important than that. This is about confusion. This is about disrupting things, because the rear, the Baltimore Pike, is also the Union supply and communication line that runs back toward Baltimore and toward Washington. So it's about causing havoc, causing chaos, causing distraction as the attack is unfolding.
Both generals were warned that a large body of rebel cavalry was in the area, and they prepared to fight. Rebel cavalry, commanded by the famous General Jeb Stuart, emerged from the trees 6,000 strong, more than twice the number of Union troops.
And Jeb Stuart himself is not an old man. I mean, he's in his 30s at this point. A lot of these prominent generals are very young at this point. And Jeb Stuart, I think he graduated West Point mid-1850s.
Stuart's mission was to support the infantry assault on the Union position led by General George Pickett. To do that, he needed to break through the Union cavalry. After 3
Important to note, too, that, and we've talked about this, but I just can't let it go by without saying it, that attack was not led by George Pickett. Pickett commanded one of 3 divisions in that attack. The attack was technically led by Longstreet, even though he didn't support the idea of the attack. Pickett was one of 3 divisions. Pickett was kind of the one that gets remembered because his division suffered the worst, and it was his division that had the role of hitting the exact Union center.
Led by General George Pickett. To do that, he needed to break through the Union cavalry. After 3 hours of fighting, Custer's men still held, and Stuart knew if he was going to accomplish his mission, he needed to attack now with everything he had.
Custer was not the only brigade that was fighting on the east. We call it the East Cavalry Field because it's east of the main battlefield, and there is a battlefield to be seen there, the East Cavalry Field. I think next time I go to Gettysburg, I want to do a video on that cavalry fight. Yes, Custer played an incredibly prominent role in that fight, but his was not the only brigade that fought for the Union.
Thousands of mounted horsemen rode at the Yankees in a wave of cavalry that would have scared most commanders, but not George Custer. Despite being dramatically outnumbered, Custer wouldn't yield the field without a fight. The young general rode to the head of his men, drew his saber, knocked his hat off his head so everyone could recognize his distinctive long flowing blonde hair, and shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines!"
No doubt whatsoever that George Custer was an incredibly brave man on the battlefield. That is not in question at all. What will eventually come into question later on after the Civil War is his judgment, not his bravery.
And then he charged straight at the rebels. The leading ranks of both sides crashed into each other with tremendous force, sending horses toppling to the ground, end over end, crushing their riders. All organizational cohesion was lost as the battle collapsed into a confused melee, individual troopers slashing at each other with their sabers or firing on each other with pistols at point-blank range. More Union cavalry struck the Confederates in their flanks in support of Custer's attack, and the rebel attack fizzled out.
So it's important to know when he talks about like saber attacks and things like that, I think we get this idea that there were all of these massive hand-to-hand combat situations in the American Civil War with bayonets and with sabers. That actually happened very few times. There were very few wounds in the grand scheme of things that happened as a result of bayonets and sabers. It did happen. And this fight, despite how long it lasted and despite the described ferocity of it, didn't produce that many casualties. Few hundred casualties on each side. I mean, in the grand scheme of the Battle of Gettysburg, it's kind of a footnote, but it was incredibly important in terms of preventing Stuart from being able to threaten the rear.
Soon enough, Stuart received the news that Pickett's charge had failed, was repulsed with heavy losses, and he ordered his troopers back. The fight at the East Cavalry Field, as it would become known, was over. Overnight, General...
Oh, this is kind of interesting, though, because... Hold on.
Back. The fight at the East Cavalry...
That says Farnsworth's charge. Farnsworth's charge was later on in what we call the South Cavalry Battle. So the last real action of the Battle of Gettysburg takes place on the southern end of the battlefield, down where Longstreet's attack had happened on July 2nd. It's in the area of like a little round top and, kind of south of the peach orchard and things like that. And it's this disastrous attack that claims the life of General Elon Farnsworth. Judson Kilpatrick, just really stupid idea on his part. But yeah, so this is actually not an image of anything that happened where Custer was.
Cavalry Field, as it would become known, was over. Overnight, General Custer was a household name, a hero lauded by both his supporters and the northern newspapers. It was, perhaps, his finest hour. Custer commanded the Michigan Cavalry Brigade with great distinction for the rest of the war, participating in several more major engagements. In April 1865, he was the first Union general to receive a flag of truce from the rebels as their position became hopeless. He was present at Appomattox when General Lee formally surrendered his army, effectively ending the war.
I think, I'd have to look this up to be sure, but I think Custer came away from the surrender with the table that the surrender happened on. What happened was after the surrender happened, Wilmer McLean, who owned the house where the surrender took place, and who had been a farmer whose farm was on the field of Bull Run back at the beginning of the war, all the Union officers started like offering him a bunch of money for pieces of furniture from the room. I want to look that up though. Okay, so here's the surrender table, and it was sent by General Sheridan, who was in command of the Union cavalry at the end of the war. Sent by General Sheridan to Libby Custer in Monroe, Michigan, with the note, "I wanted you to have this table upon which the surrender was signed, because no single person contributed more to the end of the war than your husband." Pretty crazy stuff.
In recognition for his service to the Union victory, Custer's commander, General Philip Sheridan, purchased the table the two generals had used to sign the Articles of Surrender and presented it to Custer's new wife, Elizabeth.
Take a shot. If you're new to the channel, we have this kind of running joke where if I say something right before the video says it, it's a drinking game. You have to take a shot. So this is what happens when I haven't watched these videos ahead of time, so I don't know what they're about to say.
Known as Libby, Custer entered the war as a major general and a hero to the victorious North. He was only 25 years old. Obviously, great things were in his future. There was, however, one looming problem. With the war over, the Grand Army of the Republic was being broken up, its soldiers sent home to resume their civilian lives. The peacetime army was to be much, much smaller than the 2 million men mustered during the war, and for those professional officers that wished to remain in the army, well, the fact was, there were simply more generals than there were slots to employ them.
So this is not unique to the American Civil War. This is anytime you have a rapid expansion. You know, World War II, the U.S. ends up with like 16 million people in the service. And then when you go back down to a peacetime army, everybody gets reduced in rank. And so throughout the Civil War, men had two different ranks among the officers. The officers had two different ranks. You had your volunteer army rank, which was your rank during the war, and then you had your regular army rank. And so a lot of times regular army rank tended to lag behind volunteer army rank. So occasionally you'll see that with officers. I'll pull up an example and show you what I'm talking about. So here's a great example. Here's Ulysses S. Grant, and you see his where it says component. So you see here, he's a captain on August 5th, hey, my birthday, 1853, when he's promoted to captain in the regular army. Okay, then his next rank is June 17th, 1861. He's made a colonel, but that's the volunteer rank. So once the war's over, if he remained in the army, he would revert to the rank of captain. He's made a brigadier general volunteers in 1861. February 62, he's made a major general volunteers. July 4th, 1863, that's the date of the surrender of Vicksburg. Now, granted, this rank was he was probably promoted later, and it was dated to that date. And why does it matter that it was dated to that date? Because that gives you rank on people who say somebody else has made a major general in the regular army on July 5th, 1863. You outrank them. So July 4th, 1863, he's made a major general in the regular army. That means when the war's over, Grant stays a major general in the peacetime army. And there's only a certain number of those slots going to be available. He's made a lieutenant general straight to the regular army rank on March 4th, 1864, and then July 25th, 66, he's made a 4-star general. So then here's Custer. And you see regular army, you see captain, temporary aide-de-camp. So he's made a captain June 1862. But a month later, he's made a first lieutenant, which is a lower rank, but that's regular army. Then he's made brigadier general in the volunteers. So he's still only a first lieutenant in the regular army. So at that point, if the war ends, he reverts back to first lieutenant unless he's given a promotion in the regular army, which he is given some of those, including some brevet ranks, which brevet ranks are like an honorary thing, but don't really carry with them the full weight of that rank. So he's eventually made he's still just a captain in the regular army, May 64. All these other ranks are brevets. Brevet colonel, brevet brigadier general, brevet major general in the regular army. He's made a major general of volunteers April of 1865, but that's after the war is effectively over in the East, and so he's mustered out. And so at that point, he is, though, given a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the regular army in July of 66.
So George Custer, who once commanded thousands, found himself a lieutenant colonel in command of a single cavalry regiment. All
right, time out. This is a little bit confusing, and I understand why they say this here. He was not technically the commanding officer of the 7th Cavalry. He was the second in command. The colonel was in command. But the colonel, in this case, basically had a desk job and never really took the field with the 7th Cavalry. So even though Custer is technically the second in command, in the field he's commanding because he's the highest ranking officer in the field.
7th United States Cavalry. Garrison duty in Western forts was a far cry from glorious cavalry charges on Civil War battlefields. His soldiers were not the idealistic volunteers he commanded before, but poor immigrants who were often the only ones willing to accept the low pay and dismal conditions that the army offered, and they all increasingly grew to dislike Custer. The man was not transitioning well to his loss of rank and responsibility and started taking it out on his subordinates with random outbursts of temper and often blurring the lines between strict discipline and outright cruelty.
I would not go so far as to say that none of the men liked Custer, but it's definitely true that among the officers and many of the men, they weren't fans.
Erratic behavior ended in 1867 when he was court-martialed for being absent without leave from his post and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was suspended without pay for a year, which seems harsh until you consider that if it had been any other officer, he would have been dismissed from the army entirely. His war record and his powerful friends in the high command allowed him to get away with a slap on the wrist.
And a lot of that, it's not just that he had powerful friends like Sheridan and folks like that. It's also that a lot of this is in honor of his service in the Civil War. He did really, really well in the Civil War, and that bought him a lot of goodwill among people who were in positions to help him in the post-war world.
It's not the last time this occurs in his career. In 1868, the American Indian tribes on the Great Plains were growing increasingly tired of the US government's failed promises to keep white settlers out of territory promised to them by treaties. Tribes like the Lakota and the Cheyenne began raiding white settlements, fighting back against what they...
This is a fascinating picture, by the way, and this might be one for a future episode talking about amazing pictures from history. Look at this picture, because right there, plain as day, is General Sherman with his 3-star rank. So fascinating photographs showing these men meeting together.
They saw as encroachments on their land and their way of life. Unfortunately, this gave the government pretext for war against the hostile savages, as most whites of the time period believed them to be. That winter, George Sheridan planned an operation designed to force the Southern Cheyenne bands onto designated reservations, which would open up other land for white settlement. The fact that these lands were far away from the buffalo herds that the Plains tribes relied on was not a consideration.
It's important to note, too, just kind of as an aside, as an Ohioan myself, that kind of the big three generals in the post-war world are Grant, who then is going to become president by the time most of these events take place, Sherman, and Sheridan. And they're all from Ohio. So, there's a fellow Ohioan in Custer, so there's an additional layer of connection with him.
One of the Cheyenne bands that was not yet on the reservation was a group of about 200 led by Chief Black Kettle, a survivor of the massacre of over 150 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek 4 years earlier. Despite his negative past with whites, Black Kettle was widely known as a peace chief who did not want war, but some of his younger warriors, known as dog soldiers, would not be restrained and went out on raids. The 7th Cavalry found the tracks of one of these raiding parties and followed them back to Black Kettle's winter encampment along the banks of the Washita River in modern-day western Oklahoma. On November 27, 1868, Custer attacked the camp in accordance with Sheridan's strategy to destroy the Cheyennes' livestock and shelters and force them to surrender and move to the reservation, a total war strategy that had been greatly successful in the South during the Civil War. The action of Washita, which has been called both a battle and a massacre, sparked controversy both in 1868 and today. The reported number of Cheyenne dead ranges from 20 to over 100. Nobody will ever know for sure. The dead included Black Kettle, shot in the back while trying to flee from the village with his wife. At least some of those killed were women and children, and one of the controversies over the action is whether they were caught in the crossfire or whether they were deliberately targeted by the troopers.
So you can understand why there's controversy here, depending on which lens you're looking at this through. If you're looking at this from the Native American side, well, they murdered women and children. If you're looking at this from the U.S. government side, they were caught in the crossfire as an unfortunate accident. You know, it was just one of those things that happens in war. Which is true? Probably somewhere in between, probably a little of both. You can see both sides of it.
Particularly controversial was the decision by Custer to take over 50 women and children prisoner to use as human shields, preventing the warriors from firing on the cavalry as they departed for fear of hitting their own family members.
And why does that matter? Because there's a lot of belief that some of the strategies Custer uses at Washita are going to be the same ones that he's going to use at Little Bighorn. A lot of people believe that he was trying to go down and grab women and children to use as human shields during the fighting that took place there too.
Various atrocities were reported against these captives, supposedly in retribution for similar outrages committed on white settlements. Whatever the opinion about the action itself, Custer's reputation remained intact. There was a lull in military operations after Washita as the regiment was transferred first to Kentucky and then to the Dakota Territory. Custer tried his hand at a number of business ventures during this downtime, all of which were failures, except for writing about his exploits in newspapers, and he eventually published a book called My Life on the Plains. Despite growing complaints from his subordinates, he still had the trust of his superiors, continuing to receive important assignments like leading an expedition into the Black Hills region of South Dakota in 1874. This expedition, though Custer had no idea at the time, proved to be the start of the final drama in his colorful life. The Black Hills were explicitly included in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 as part of the reservation of the Lakota or Sioux people. Thus, technically, Custer's expedition was a violation of the treaty, though officials didn't think it would pose a significant issue because the troops didn't intend to stay. Everything changed, however, when Custer reported that his expedition had found gold there, and once leaked to the newspapers, it set off a wave of excitement. A gold rush soon took shape, with prospectors flooding into the area.
So this is one of those situations where at the time, like he said, people didn't think it was a big deal. They're just passing through. They're not going to stay. They didn't really think it was going to ruffle too many feathers as far as that treaty goes. But then gold gets found, and that changes everything. And as much as I absolutely love Ulysses S. Grant, he's one of my favorite people. To his discredit, he allows this expedition. He allows this violation of the treaty to take place. And this then leads to the war that will cost Custer and his brothers their lives.
In the hopes of striking it rich, the army tried to keep them out, but conflict with the Lakota soon broke out. With the country in a depression since 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant knew that an influx of gold would be a much-needed boost to the economy. His officials made an attempt to purchase the Black Hills from the Lakota, but they refused to sell. The Black Hills were sacred to them, the place they believed the spirits had first created the world. It was the center of their entire universe, and how could you put a monetary value on that? The Americans decided they were just going to take the Black Hills instead, but once again they needed a pretext for a war with the Lakota. They found it in the lands west of the Great Sioux Reservation in Montana and Wyoming, where many of the Lakota and Cheyenne still followed after the buffalo like they had for generations, irrespective of arbitrary lines on a map. The government and the army decided to force these bands onto the reservation, knowing that they would resist and that it would lead to open war. The government sent word to the Indians in the unceded lands that they were required to move by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile.
So that's why a lot of the writings, a lot of the military dispatches, a lot of the reports that you see from 1876 are going to refer to hostiles. There's even a movie that came out recently with Christian Bale, I think, that's called Hostiles. They're referring to the ones who don't listen when they're told you have to get onto these reservations. Anybody who's not is considered a hostile. And so in movies, even about the Little Bighorn, you see them refer to the hostiles.
Deadline was a sham and everyone knew it. Even if the bands in question had been inclined to move, they would have been unable to until spring thaw. When the deadline passed, General Sheridan enacted his war plan. Troop columns moved into the area from the west, east, and south, hoping to trap hostile bands in a pincer. Custer and the 7th Cavalry were part of the Dakota Column, which left Fort Abraham Lincoln in North Dakota and headed west into Montana in May 1876.
And what he means by column is this was a multi-pronged, I think there were 3 columns that were coming in from different directions, and they were supposed to be working in concert, in unison, together. And this is one of the things about Custer. Custer does really well with his kind of brash personality, his bravado, his dash, things like that. It works really well in the Civil War because he's under higher command that can rein him in when necessary. The problem comes when he's out there on his own with no higher authority there to rein that in. Now that dash, that bravado, that brashness can get him in trouble.
All 3 columns were to converge in the area of the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers in southern Montana, where it was believed that the largest concentration of Indian encampments were. They were more right than they realized. On the banks of the Little Bighorn was the largest Plains Indian camp in living memory. Every warrior who wanted to fight the whites had gathered in one place, drawn by the leadership of Lakota Chief Sitting Bull, who was believed to be a powerful medicine man whose visions foretold a great Indian victory over the whites. The warriors were a mix of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, numbering between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, twice as many as pre-war government estimates. Custer and the 7th Cavalry detached from the rest of the column to scout ahead, and they found this village early on the morning of June the 25th. Despite being warned by his Crow and Arikara scouts about the size of the village, Custer still believed that he was facing no more than 800, including non-combatants like women and children.
Now, I'm not going to get too much into the details of the battle itself. I've done another video on the Battle of Little Bighorn, talking about the weapons, talking about the tactics, talking about what unfolded that day, and I'll throw a link up at the end if you want to check that out, so we won't talk much about that here.
Decided not to wait for reinforcements because he believed had been spotted and was worried the various bands would scatter. He believed the Indians would run away when he attacked, another flawed assumption. Custer split his regiment, numbering about 700 men, into battalions for the attack. He himself led 5 companies to ride around the village and attack from the north, while 3 companies under the command of Major Marcus Reno attacked from the south. Reno soon found himself heavily engaged by far more warriors than he'd been expecting, and was compelled to retreat to a hilltop, where he was joined by 3 companies led by Captain Frederick Benteen.
And so, yeah, the one thing I will say is it's important to remember that the entire 7th Cavalry was not wiped out at Little Bighorn, only the elements that were under Custer's direct command. The elements that he split off, and they were actually broke into 4, because there was also a unit that was protecting the pack trains. And so the other elements survived for the most part. There were some casualties, but they weren't wiped out.
Who had been similarly overwhelmed while trying to support Custer. This group found itself surrounded, fighting for its life over the course of the next 2 days, before the approach of the rest of the Dakota Column compelled Sitting Bull to disband the encampment, and the various bands headed off in different directions. It was only then, on June the 27th, that his comrades found out what had happened to Custer's group. To the northeast of where the encampment had been was a grisly scene. Blue-coated bodies were lying all over, many of them scalped or mutilated. On a hilltop known today as Last Stand Hill, George Armstrong Custer's body was found, surrounded by the bodies of his men. He'd been shot twice, in the head and in the heart.
Surrounded not only by his men, but 2 of his brothers, including his brother Tom, who was the very first double recipient of the Medal of Honor. Received the Medal of Honor for 2 separate actions in the last week of the war in Virginia. He was killed. I think his brother Boston was killed. There was, I think, a brother-in-law and a cousin, or maybe a nephew, that were killed. It was multiple family members who died there.
Every man he led into battle that day met the same fate. Over 200 in all. The dead included 2 of Custer's brothers, his brother-in-law, and his nephew. At only
take a shot.
36 years old, his once brilliant military career had ended in disaster. The news of the defeat and the death of Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn reached the East Coast during the nation's centennial celebrations and was met with shock and horror by the American public. Libby Custer emerged from her mourning period determined to preserve her late husband's reputation. She believed had died a hero and deserved to be recognized as such. She blamed Major Reno and Captain Ben Dean for the death of her husband, accusing them of cowardice. A court of inquiry held in 1879 found Reno blameless for the defeat, but accusations that he was incompetent or a coward or a drunk dogged him until his death.
And again, Reno's another guy that's important to note. I think there was probably some panic that did happen there, but to blame him for Custer's defeat, no, that defeat's on Custer. He split his men in the face of a superior enemy without knowing the information about what he was attacking, and he put them in an impossible situation. Reno had shown incredible bravery during the American Civil War himself. So again, no doubt about the man's courage.
And for many years afterwards. Initially, Custer was buried with his men on the battlefield, but in 1877 his body was exhumed. At least it was believed to be his body. Some historians believe they might have actually dug up the wrong corpse, and it was...
Or what they did find, even if it is Custer, was not all of Custer. It was parts of his body to bury at West Point.
Brought to West Point, where he was reinterred with full military honors in the West Point Cemetery. By that point, the Great Sioux War was over, the victory at the Little Bighorn only delaying the inevitable. Lakota chief Crazy Horse, who had led his warriors to victory, was compelled to surrender in 1877 and was killed in custody a few months later. Sitting Bull went with his band to Canada and managed to hold out until 1881, when he too was forced to come in. The US government forced the Lakota to give up the Black Hills by threatening to cut off their food supplies on the reservation if they did not comply. Facing starvation, they had no choice. Over 100 years later, in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been illegally taken from the Lakotas. They ordered the United States to compensate the Sioux Nation for its loss, money that the Lakota have refused to take because they never wanted to sell the land in the first place. Libby Custer was her husband's biggest advocate in the decades after Little Bighorn, and is largely responsible for his initial status as the American martyr in the cultural memory of the country. Custer was one of the heroes of the Old West, an essential character in any game of cowboys and Indians, and the story of his last stand became one of the most famous in American history. His character has appeared in at least 30 movies, including by such famous actors as Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan, and many books were written about him, often hagiographic in nature. However, as the United States began to come to grips with the awful tragedy that had been inflicted on American Indians in the 18th and 19th centuries, not only on the Great Plains, but all over the country, people began to view George Custer's life and deeds in a new light. Because he had been so famous, almost mythical, he was singled out for special criticism. Military researchers have concluded that the defeat at Little Bighorn was largely Custer's own fault, that he had blundered into a situation he didn't fully understand and had gotten himself and his men killed. Whether he did so out of a misguided sense of duty or out of a vainglorious need to heap further laurels upon himself, or a mixture of both,
or overconfidence.
Today, George Custer provides much more mixed reaction than he did 100 years ago. Some have called him a butcher, a callous murderer, accused of killing and raping women and children and using them as human shields. Others claim he was no better or worse than any other white man of the period, that he didn't hate Indians, he just did what his government ordered him to do as an army officer.
I think that's probably fair. I don't know that he hated them any more than anybody else did. I think it's probably a mix of all of those things they just mentioned. So, in wrapping this up, like I said, there's a video you can check out where I kind of go a little more into detail about the events of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. If you want to talk more about that, please, if you think I've earned it, consider hitting that subscribe button. Hit the like button if you would. Leave your comments. Let's talk more about this. Let's learn together. Thanks for watching.